What is up, fam? Welcome to week 4 of Wisdom Wednesday. I cannot believe it's been a month already, and I'm really excited about just this journey and getting to share things that I'm learning as I go along. Someone recently asked me, why am I doing Wisdom Wednesdays? I think as we are growing, especially in my group of early mid 20s range, that there is a lot of unknowns and a lot of pressure and just a lot that people go through. And I think on social media, we tend to just show up in highlights of our life. But I am very passionate about promoting and encouraging people to be authentic, to embrace vulnerability, because I think it's in a way to show courage when you show up as you actually are instead of how you feel that you should when you're trying to fit in. And that's what I think I'm trying to do in my own journey through this. I know it's very therapeutic for me to share what I'm learning through and helps me process. And I hope along the way that it can just encourage someone else to show up as their true selves. And this is extremely uncomfortable for me and way out of my comfort zone, but I want to push myself and I want to challenge. And even if it just encourages one person and makes them feel seen, I think that's a fantastic thing, and it's worth trying to do. In relation to that, today I want to talk about 2 books that I finished reading, and lately this has kind of been like a book review thing, but I feel like as time moves along, I'm not going to be able to have to be able to read a book in a week or things like that, but I think these 2 books relate to the topic of empathy. And last week we talked about showing up for yourself and practicing self-compassion. And in that, when we learn to be kind to ourselves first, I think it allows us to strengthen our ability to be empathetic for others and to be comfortable in stepping into someone else's shoes. So today, the 2 books I want to talk about was first, one of them a friend let me borrow, and it is Brene Brown's Braving the Wilderness. And anything Brene Brown reads, writes, shares, I believe is profound. Her mission is to encourage people to show up as their most authentic selves, and I love her work so much. So what I got out of Braving the Wilderness, which is also entitled The Quest for True Belonging and the Courage to Stand Alone. She made me feel so seen in reading this book because I haven't heard another person use the terms of a paradoxical life. So talking about as we live life, we just encounter paradoxes all the time. And this is how I've been feeling pretty much my whole life, just that constantly in an internal battle, kind of being on that 0 or 100 personality side. And as she's describing through these chapters of these paradoxes, including how to belong and yet be an individual, I felt like I learned so much, and that's what I want to share. So first off, she talks about true belonging in this. And in our culture, especially in social media, we feel a lot of pressure to fit in, to post the trendy things and all of that. Her main message is to truly belong, we must belong to ourselves and be our authentic and unique selves. It's the harder road, but it's also more rewarding. And in it, she dives into these different paradoxes we face in our lives as a society. I love the titles of the chapters because to me, it relates to building empathy and strengthening our empathetic muscle is what I'm calling it. Really just looking at a person, the golden rule, treat someone else as you wish to be treated. And empathy, I think we can always, in whatever time, day, place in life we are, use a little more empathy to feel in community. So one of the titles is People Are Hard to Hate Close Up, Move In. So in this paradox, it talks about when we generalize a certain type of person or group of people, it's easy to put them down, to feel like you're completely different from them, and to isolate oneself from them. And the paradox in this is the way to create true connection is to move into the discomfort and to reach out to understand people. I think as we get into a more polarized political sphere, this tool, though it is extremely uncomfortable, is extremely needed into reaching out to the other side of people that you believe are different than you in whatever political beliefs or values that they have. But at the end of the day, people are people. And she talks about in families how a lot of tension can arise from different political views. But if you move in closer to see the true core of where people stand, I think at the end of the day, we all stand in the same place, which is wanting to find or be loved, wanting to be successful, wanting a family, wanting friends, and all of that. And so we have more commonalities than differences, as that's what was all coming up for me as someone that's very passionate about dispelling cultural stereotypes and promoting cultural learning so that we can actually create room for connection instead of judgment. I'm realizing, wow, even in my own country, I think this is extremely relevant, and it all ties into empathy and really trying to put yourself into someone else's shoes and see their values and their perspectives and doing it in a way of respect. Relating to respect, another title is titled Speak Truth to BS, but Be Civil. And what I love about this is also like the paradoxical way of approaching relationships, right? We should search for connection, but be true to ourselves. And so don't succumb to trying to fit into the group by diminishing who you truly are. And in this, what I've learned is it's okay to have opinions. It's okay to disagree with someone. But what she talks about is we have to bring in civility into the conversations. One of the things that she said in this book that really hit me is comparing languages and how we talk badly about other groups of people, but then get offended when groups of our own people are talked about in that way. But what really hit me and called me out in realizing the power of language and the targeting, even if it's just in minute words, was if a Democratic female politician gets called a negative female word and that offends you, then a Republican female candidate getting called that word should also offend you. If a Republican president was called a negative term and that offended you, then calling a Democratic president that same term or a different one should also offend you. And so she really just talks about conditional empathy is what we're used to. And in this polarized world, I feel like that's becoming more of the common way of going about things. But she calls it out and she says it's not easy. We have to be able to call people out on BS, so it doesn't mean like we just put up with anything, but we have to be civil about it. At the end of the day, we are all humans. We all have the same desires, and the braving the wilderness part is, though it is harder, it is the more rewarding path to creating a community, a true community that we feel seen and belong in. Lastly, what she talks about in it is a strong back, a soft front, and a wild heart. How I would describe it is we have to have the courage to be our true and authentic selves, and that is the strong back. The paradox in that is when we are authentic, we have to be open to relationships, right? But to have the soft front is to be vulnerable instead of putting up that protective shield that we all do in whatever situation it is, whether it is in a new romantic relationship, whether it is talking to someone that is on the other end of the aisle as you, whether it is just someone that you find very different and you're uncomfortable. We have to maintain a soft front to be open to connection. The wild heart aspect is to be brave enough to have these conversations in civil ways, in respectful ways, and in empathetic ways, where we truly try to understand the person and not try to target them or listen in a way where we can manipulate their words or what they believe so that we can come out on top. I love this book and I love anything Brene Brown says or writes because I truly believe in her message of people should show up as their authentic selves. And another thing that I'm jumping around that I really got from this and made me think is we have this all or nothing mentality and we try to group people into boxes. And I believe this comes from more of a caveman mindset. I think back in the day when we were all living with wild animals and hunting and gathering and all that, I think we needed this reaction, right? Of, all right, someone is coming to our cave. I got to decide real fast and categorize them. Are they friends or are they foe? And I think that is our innate reaction. When we meet someone, we ask them where they're from, what their background is, or we just jump to conclusions on what who they are, so that we can neatly categorize where they belong, if they're harmful or will they be friendly to us. At the same time that I recognize that this could be an innate quality, maybe something in our brain, I believe that we can evolve, because look at where we are in society now versus even just 100 years ago, right? So I think this book really just calls to me of, let's dive into the wilderness. Let's be brave enough to go into places that are unknown, to forge new paths, and to be more empathetic with each other. The other book that I mentioned last week that I finished is the autobiography of Malcolm X. What I also want to share is, in these current times and in this topic of empathy, one thing I'm trying to do is learn more about African American history in the US. And why I'm doing that is because I think when people are afraid, we tend to focus on themselves and how someone else in pain and their demands for making a change could affect us personally. I think the power in empathy, and the main point of empathy, is to practice stepping into another person's shoes, to really see where they're coming from, to see what they're going through. Selfishly, the reason why I'm doing that is because if I were in a role reversal, I would want someone to do that for me. So empathy, I think, also relates to people's pains and whatever that is going on in the world right now, and just being willing to listen and willing to learn and willing to try to help in whatever way. Before diving into the book, I just want to mention what I knew about Malcolm X, which is very little. That's a pun because his name is Malcolm Little. Okay, I'm way too cheesy. I remember growing up in elementary school, we would always talk about MLK Jr. and we would mention Malcolm X, but I don't remember us ever truly diving into anything about him. And I felt like it was almost posed as Malcolm X versus MLK, Martin Luther King Jr., in the way where Malcolm X was drawn to be more of a radicalist, and MLK Jr. preached nonviolence and integration, and it seemed to paint Malcolm X into a category of extremist, reverse racist, as he refers to some of the people that calls him later in his life in here. And this book really opened up my eyes to one man's story and how that has impacted history. Forgive me if I mess up on the facts. I started the book a year ago, but I didn't finish it until this week. So in the beginning, it talks about since his childhood. Malcolm X's father was murdered by a white supremacist group, and he was a child in a large family. I think it was 6 or 7 children, and his family was split up by the foster care system because other people deemed his mother not able to take care of his family. And then he goes into his education as a child. There was a time where a teacher asked him, "What do you want to be?" And he said, "I want to be a lawyer." And the teacher said they use negative language that I'm not going to use on here, but you can imagine what word it is. They said, "People like you can't be lawyers, you should be a carpenter." I just imagine, like, as a child hearing that, I would be a wreck of someone trying to diminish who I am right then and there. And then it goes into, as he's in the foster care system, these group of white family that is taking care of him, and how he was class president, he was getting really good grades, but he realized that when this family would have guests over, that they would call him into the room and kind of show him off in a way that they would show off a pet, of, "Oh, look at Malcolm, he's doing so great, and these people can really change." And it was dehumanizing in a way because he felt like he wasn't being seen or valued, is what I get from it. And then he talks about moving with his sister to Boston and then into New York, and the days of where people would conk their hair, which I didn't know what it is, but I had to look it up. And conking is like that wavy look that I guess they had in like the 30s, 40s. White males would have their hair that way. And he talks about the process of African American males and what they would have to do to conk their hair, which includes using lye, which burns your scalp to get that. So he talks about beauty standards and how it's all towards the white male and what their desire is. And it's just he really takes you into the details of what he was feeling towards women, towards looks, into the exciting era of that time. He then goes into how he got into the drug scene, into robbing, into the crime, in the crime scene. He got caught with other people, including another African American man and then two females, white females. And the females did not get any jail time while the males did. Then it goes into his prison life. And I think his time in prison really just changed who he was fundamentally. That was when he just read all the time. He started debating and he was exposed to Islam. So one of his brothers came in and they said they had converted and started following Elijah Muhammad, who was the founder of the Nation of Islam. During that period, he was exposed and believed in the white devil. And just looking back at his own personal life experiences, he saw how at that time the white male had affected his own life path, from his father being murdered, from the white superior group splitting up his family, to defining beauty standards and them following suit, and within his time in Harlem and working in New York, of being exposed to the double standards for white males versus African American males. And in that, he comes to start preaching about the white devil. And I think this is the Malcolm X that I learned a little bit about when I was a kid, the radical side. But as the book continues, when he gets out of prison, he becomes a devout follower of Elijah Muhammad and a minister for the Nation of Islam. And he does keep on preaching about the way white society has very much controlled African Americans. Then he takes a trip to Mecca. He does the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, to the Holy Land, for Islam. And what I have never heard about was his shift in perspective from this trip. While he was there, he also did a trip to the Middle East and to Africa. He found true brotherhood, is what he calls it, true community and belonging. And he writes back to people in the US stating his perspective has changed. He no longer believes in the white devil as an individual. It is the collective society that he is identifying that targets the African American population and puts them down and does nothing to help improve it. Then it continues talking about the internal threats and issues between Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm X himself, and kind of the split of Nation of Islam. And then in his assassination, it does mention that he felt like there were lots of death threats coming before that. The ending of the book is an epilogue written by Alex Haley, who wrote the autobiography. But what I learned was the way that it was written was Malcolm X was signed for a contract to write an autobiography, and Alex Haley would interview him. And the way that others talk about Malcolm X's character, I feel like he was a very unique man, a very powerful man, a very strong orator. And I love his passion for learning and for reading and for constantly trying to improve. I very much respect that. But as I'm going through this book, what I got out of it is sometimes we only hear or see one side of a person's story. And yes, this is his personal story, so other people could view him differently, especially at that time. What I've never heard anyone mention is the shift that he had. And instead of being fueled by anger for the individual white person, he acknowledged his faults, and he changes to say the collective society is what is still suppressing African Americans today at that time. I think the unfortunate thing is a lot of parts of his story could still be relevant to today's society. And in that, what I mean is his description of the pain that he felt and the pain that he had gone through, and how that turned into rage and anger and fuel, but also how he was a changed man through his religion, through Islam. And as I'm still learning more about Islam, I just found it awesome that his history and how he promoted Islam in the US because I didn't know anything about it. So if you've read Malcolm X or you have read anything Brene Brown but Braving the Wilderness, I'd love, 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 love to hear what you've gotten out of it. And as I'm sharing what I've gotten out of these books, just to circle back around to this week's topic of empathy, I think both these books really just promote trying to understand where other people who maybe you deem as different than yourself come from, what their history is, what their values are, and instead of immediately judging, which I think is a safety mechanism for most of us and it's completely natural, but trying to brave the wilderness and go through into unknown territory to try to have real and true conversations that are based in civility and respect, to learn about other people and try to do what you can to make people feel seen and heard. I think for me, that's the basis of what empathy is. And I practice it as much as I can because I know when the time comes, I want other people to be doing the same thing for me. So the golden rule, as always, treat others the way you want to be treated. And that is something I definitely remember from elementary school days. This one was long. This one was definitely uncomfortable for me, but I'm excited about that because as Brene Brown says, and I practice, courage over comfort always. Have a good and wise and mindful week.